At the beginning of the story, we see a man named Frank, who at that moment was standing outside his house smoking a cigarette. Then he saw something strange. There was an extremely beautiful sight in the sky, which is usually called the Northern Light. Such light is normally seen in the sky around the North Pole. But that night, somehow this scene was visible from New York City. However, Frank did not pay much special attention to this thing. He had a big radio with him, which he used to talk to random unknown people. But that night, when he turned on the radio, he ended up talking to his own son, who told him that he had now turned 36 years old. Meaning, somehow, his radio had caught a signal from the future, 30 years ahead of the present. His son said, "Dad, save yourself. Today, you are going to die." Hearing that, Frank froze. But how did all this happen? To understand that, we need to know Frank a little. He was a firefighter whose tales of bravery were famous throughout the city. Just 2 hours ago, a petrol-filled tanker had an accident. The tanker, full of petrol, overturned on top of a sewer. 2 electricians were working below at that moment. Petrol started dripping down, and with just a small spark, everything could explode. Then a team of firefighters arrived there. Frank also arrived with them. By risking his life, Frank saved both electricians just moments before the explosion could happen. Listening to Frank's stories of bravery, many women had a crush on him. But Frank loved only 2 people in this world: his wife Julia and his son John. Julia was a nurse in a hospital who took care of her patients just like they were a part of her family. Then the story returned to the same moment where it had started. That night, when the sky was filled with light and John turned on the radio exactly 30 years later, the same light spread across the sky again. Now John's son had become a 36-year-old police detective. He was an expert at catching criminals, but he was a little tangled up in his personal life. His girlfriend had also left him because he still had not come out of his past sorrows. In fact, 30 years ago, on that very night, his father had died. John was only 6 years old back then. Frank had gone to a warehouse to extinguish a fire, but only his burnt body returned. That day, John lost everything along with his father. Even after 36 years, he still carried the grief of that day. His house was still filled with memories of his father. Old photographs, baseball trophies, and the same table where Frank used to sit and run the radio. When John returned home after meeting his mother Julia, he saw that his childhood friend Gordo had come there with his son. While playing, Gordo's son found Frank's old radio. Seeing it brought back old memories in John's heart. After some time, Gordo and his son left. The radio was still on, and John started watching TV. Suddenly, he heard someone's voice coming from the radio. "CQ15, CQ15, come in. Is anyone listening?" John went near the mic and said, "Hello, I'm speaking from New York City. My name is John. Who are you?" The voice on the other side replied that he thought this radio could reach as far as China or Japan, but John turned out to be from his own city. He said, "Anyway, John, if you're from New York, then there's a big baseball match tomorrow. You will watch it, right? Which team are you supporting?" Hearing this, John was shocked because the match that this man was talking about had happened 30 years ago. He said, "Are you joking? Why would I watch a 30-year-old match now?" For a few moments, the radio became completely silent. Then John heard something strange. The man was calling his son Little Chief. Hearing this, John's heart stopped. This was the same name his father used to call him when he was a child. John asked, "By the way, what is your name?" The reply came from the other side. "Frank Sullivan." Hearing this, John's face turned pale. He thought it must be some prank by Gordo. He said, "Gordo, this is a very bad joke. I will deal with you tomorrow." But the voice said, "Gordo? You mean my neighbor's son? Do I sound like a child to you? I'm really Frank Sullivan. And since you know my neighbor too, then tell me, who are you?" But John said, "Stop talking nonsense. Frank Sullivan is my father's name. He died 30 years ago. I am his son, John Sullivan, speaking from his house in Queens, New York." Hearing this, the man on the other side went completely silent. His face appeared, and seeing this, John was shocked. It was really Frank, his father, who had died 30 years ago. What was happening was nothing short of a miracle. That day, both Frank and John had seen the same glow in the sky at the same time. His radio had magically connected to the time 30 years earlier. Frank and John both found it very difficult to believe this. In panic, Frank accidentally dropped his cigarette on the table. The cigarette fell on something flammable, and the wood caught fire. But Frank noticed it and quickly put out the fire. Meanwhile, 30 years later, John was sitting at the same table with the same radio. Suddenly, the same burn mark appeared on his table. Seeing this, John was shocked. Now he understood that he was really talking to his father. He said, "You burned the table, right? I can see it." Hearing this, Frank felt the ground slip beneath his feet. It felt like someone was standing right next to him making fun of him. He shouted into the radio, "Listen, who are you? Stay away from my family, or I'll break your bone. Understood?" To this, John said that for that to happen, he would have to stay alive first. "Dad, you are going to die." John told him that tomorrow morning, a warehouse was going to catch fire. Frank would go there to extinguish it and die there. Frank said, "What nonsense are you talking?" But John cut him off and said, "Listen to me carefully. When you go to put out the fire, Do not take the exit near the window. Use the other exit. Understand? On the other side, Frank suddenly turned off the radio. He still felt someone was fooling him. The next morning, when Frank reached the station, he got the news that a warehouse had indeed caught fire. Now he started to believe the man on the radio a little. Frank and his team reached the site. The fire was extremely intense. A woman came running and cried, saying her daughter was trapped inside. Frank paused for a moment, a little scared, thinking maybe this was the day he was supposed to die. But still, he did not forget his duty. Somehow he went inside and reached the upper floor. He found the girl unconscious. He lifted her on his shoulder and took her near the window. The team was trying to reach there with a ladder, but the mechanism failed. Then Frank remembered John's word. He immediately ran to the other side and escaped through the ventilator route. Now, 30 years later, John was sitting in a bar with Gordo and police officer Satch. Satch was Frank's old friend. Today, 30 years had passed since Frank's death, so the three of them were talking about him. John was still thinking that last night's radio incident was just a dream. Suddenly, new memories began forming in his mind, such memories that he had never known before, moments spent with his father that he had never truly lived. Suddenly, memories started appearing, as if he was going to school with his father, as if he was playing with him, as if Frank had never. He had not died. Suddenly, the glass slipped from John's hand and fell to the floor. He exclaimed in shock that his father had not perished in the fire 30 years ago. Upon hearing this, Gordo and Satch were taken aback, their eyes wide with surprise. Gordo responded calmly, saying that, yes, they already knew the truth. John's father had actually passed away from cancer 10 years ago. John was stunned by this revelation, but then a smile slowly spread across his face. In that moment, he realized that he had genuinely spoken to his father and that Frank had listened to him. That was why he had survived the fire. A new memory surfaced in his mind. Frank had been a chain smoker, lighting a new cigarette as soon as the previous one burned out. It was this very habit that eventually caused him to develop cancer. In the past, Frank had heroically rescued a young girl from a burning building. He later discovered that a massive explosion had occurred in the exact room where he had been standing earlier. Had he remained there, he would have perished that day. This confirmed Frank's belief that the person speaking to him over the radio was indeed his son, 30 years into the future. Frank returned home and tried once more to contact John over the radio, but there was no signal. Meanwhile, John was overwhelmed with happiness. That night, when he returned home, he noticed that all the photographs had changed. Even the newspaper clipping that had previously reported Frank's death now stated that the firefighter had saved the girl. On the table, a note read, "I'm alive, Chief." Tears welled up in John's eyes as he read it. Once again, they connected over the radio and talked for hours. John shared details about the future with his father, who would win the baseball championship that year, when he would buy his preferred car, everything. Finally, he revealed the most critical detail, that his father would die from cancer due to chain smoking. He pleaded, "Please, Dad, quit smoking." Frank became deeply emotional upon hearing that. The day before, Frank had visited the hospital to see his wife, Julia. Julia was attending to a patient when she noticed him. She instructed her junior staff member to continue managing the patient and came to Frank. He was filled with joy, as if he had been given a second chance at life. While they were talking, Julia observed that her junior was about to administer the wrong medication. She rushed and stopped, saving the patient's life. Frank expressed his love to Julia and returned home. Meanwhile, the older John was asleep when he experienced a strange and vivid dream. In it, a family member had died, and their funeral was underway. The younger John was sitting in a corner, frightened, quietly crying. At that moment, he noticed his mother's locket. Seeing it, John suddenly awoke, drenched in sweat. Strangely, he could not forget the dream. Every face, every detail remained vividly etched in his mind, as if it were not a dream but an actual memory. Panic-stricken, John called his mother, but a strange woman answered the phone. He tried again, only for the same thing to happen. He assumed there might be a network issue. Afterward, he prepared to meet his girlfriend, Samantha. Now that his father was safe, a heavy burden had been lifted from his heart, and he wanted to apologize to her. But the moment he saw Samantha, she did not recognize him at all, as if they had never met. John was stunned and momentarily speechless. He then thought perhaps she was merely angry. He decided to return to work at the police station. However, things seemed unusually strange there as well. John's chief, Satch, who had previously treated him like a friend, now behaved differently. He began acting harshly toward John. Satch handed him a case file. Both of them had been working on the case for several days. A few days prior, a body had been discovered buried at a construction site, reduced to bones alone. Satch explained that it belonged to a nurse named Mary Finley, the first victim of a serial killer named Nightingale. This killer, 30 years ago, had selectively targeted nurses and had never been identified by the police. Satch expressed his shock, remarking on the tragedy. 10 people had been killed 30 years ago, and the police had still not caught the killer. John was slightly stunned by this. According to him, Nightingale had killed only 3 nurses 30 years ago and then vanished without a trace. But when John looked at the murder file again, he felt as if the ground had slipped from beneath his feet. His mother, Julia, was listed as a victim. This revelation completely overwhelmed John. He rushed home and saw that Julia was missing from the family photograph. Then, a terrifying realization struck him. The changes he had made in the past to save his father had entirely altered the present-day timeline. John immediately used the radio to contact his father in the past once more and explain how massive changes were unfolding in their timeline. He revealed that the serial killer, Nightingale, would murder his mother, Julia. Frank was utterly shocked. He demanded to know what John was saying and when it would happen. John explained that it would occur on the night of October 22nd, approximately a week after his current time, and asked if anything unusual had happened at the hospital the previous day. Frank recalled that after narrowly escaping death, he had happily visited Julia at the hospital. John immediately understood that something significant had occurred there, which had led to his mother's death in the future. Frank reassured him, saying, "Don't worry, John. If you are certain that Nightingale will kill Julia on the night of October 22nd, I will ensure it doesn't happen. Nightingale won't even cast a shadow near my wife." John warned, "Dad, this will save Mom, but think, Nightingale had already killed 2 women before Mom, and would kill 4 more innocent women afterward, all because of our meddling. Can we just let them die? We cannot allow him to kill innocent people." They knew which woman Nightingale would target next, yet Frank was unsure of what to do. He asked John if he should inform the police about the attack. John advised, "Dad, this is not the police's job. It's yours. You must follow her and figure out who Nightingale really is. Once we identify him, perhaps the police can apprehend him." Frank agreed, though he felt fear. Summoning his courage, he went to the bar John had mentioned, the precise location where the next murder was planned. This time, the target was a nurse named Carrie, who would arrive there in the evening. John had clearly informed Frank from the police file that Carrie would leave the bar at 7:30 p.m., and her body would be found behind the bar by 8:00 p.m., meaning the attack would occur between 7:30 and 8. John strictly instructed Frank to watch anyone following her and immediately called the police. Frank was already seated in the bar when Carrie arrived with her friends. The women recognized him instantly, the brave firefighter who had recently saved a girl. They were impressed and engaged him in conversation for hours. Meanwhile, Frank remained unaware that Nightingale was quietly observing him from within the bar. Nightingale was, in fact, the same man who had been Julia's patient at the hospital. Now, everything became clear. Had John not intervened in time, Frank would have died in the fire, and events would have unfolded exactly as they were destined. Julia's attention would have shifted to the news, and she would have rushed to her husband, preventing her junior from making a mistake, which would have resulted in Nightingale being killed that day. That story would have ended there. But now the man survived. Frank remained alive, and Julia did not leave the hospital. Frank immediately went to meet her. Before her junior could make a mistake, Julia stopped him. That was when all the trouble began. Nightingale survived and continued targeting nurses. Today, however, Frank had unintentionally disrupted Nightingale's plan by preventing him from killing Carrie. Consequently, in the future, Carrie's case file vanished from police records. John was immensely relieved, yet Nightingale's identity remained unknown. John informed Frank that the next target was a nurse named C.C. Clark, who also worked as a waiter in a nightclub after her shift. Nightingale planned to kill her that night, between 2:00 a.m. and 5:00 a.m. Frank now knew this and was heading to the bar. Frank arrived at the bar. C.C. was already there, and he waited patiently until 2:00 a.m. As closing time approached, C.C. went upstairs to change clothes. Frank followed her discreetly into the bathroom to keep an eye on her. Suddenly, he was attacked. It was Nightingale. Frank tried to fight back, but Nightingale overpowered him and rendered him unconscious. The killer then stole Frank's wallet, took out his driving license, and fled. When Frank regained consciousness, he immediately ran upstairs to find C.C., but by then, Nightingale had already killed her. Terrified and distraught, Frank returned home and informed John that he had failed to save C.C. and that Nightingale now possessed his driving license. Their situation had grown even grimmer. They still did not know Nightingale's identity, but now the killer knew everything about Frank and could potentially reach Julia and the younger John as well. Frank was scared, but John reassured him. After thinking for a moment, John suddenly said, "Dad, if Nightingale touched your wallet, there must be his fingerprints on it. Listen carefully. Hide your wallet somewhere special, somewhere no one can touch it for the next 30 years. Frank followed his instructions exactly. He placed his wallet in a sealed packet and carefully hid it in an old wooden box near a window in the house. 30 years later, the older John opened the same box, and the wallet remained completely intact. Overjoyed, he informed Frank via radio, "Dad, don't worry. I'll find out who Nightingale really is." John took the wallet to the police station to run a fingerprint check. When the results arrived, everyone was stunned. Nightingale was no ordinary man. He was a retired police officer named Jack Shepard. John located Jack, who was still alive and living a respectable life. He carefully spoke to Jack while hiding all old letters, trying to gather information about Nightingale. Later, he returned home and explained to Frank over the radio that Nightingale's real name was Jack Jack Shepard, a former policeman. John advised Frank to call the FBI from a public phone and inform them that Jack was the serial killer responsible for the nurse murder. After each killing, Jack kept some personal item from the victim, like a locket or jewelry. John hoped that when the FBI raided Jack's house, they would find enough evidence to imprison him for good, but fate was not on their side. Before Frank could act, Chief Satch arrived at his home. Some neighbors had seen Frank at the bar when he went to save CC. Worse still, Jack had placed Frank's driving license near CC's body, convincing Satch that Frank was the murderer, the real Nightingale. Satch arrested Frank and forcibly took him to the police station. In the scuffle, Frank's radio fell to the ground and broke, severing the connection between him and John. Satch began a rigorous interrogation. Frank tried desperately to explain that he had been speaking to his future son over the radio, and that John had told him that Jack Shepard was the real serial killer, the one killing nurses one by one. But Satch refused to believe him, thinking Frank was fabricating excuses to escape. Frank even revealed the results of baseball matches that John had told him about from the future, but Satch angrily stopped listening. At that moment, Julia arrived at the police station to see Frank. Satch did not allow her to meet him, taking her instead to a cafe and claiming that her husband was a serial killer. Meanwhile, Jack arrived at the police station. Using his past influence as a police officer, he accessed the custody area without restriction and aimed a gun at Frank, intending to kill him on the spot. Just then, another officer entered the room. Jack hid his intent and acted normal, engaging the officer and leaving with him. Frank, realizing Jack would return, noticed an electric wire. He quickly connected it to his jail cell's iron door and waited. In the cafe, Satch was telling Julia that her husband was a killer, leaving her shattered. However, when Satch's attention shifted to a baseball match on TV, he saw events unfolding exactly as Frank had predicted. Shocked, Satch realized Frank had been telling the truth. Meanwhile, Jack returned to Frank's cell, ready to kill him. As he touched the iron door, a massive electric shock knocked him unconscious. Frank searched Jack's pockets and found the address on his license. He triggered the fire alarm at the station, flooding the area with water and creating chaos, allowing Jack to flee. Frank resolved to prove his innocence and expose the real killer. He went to Jack's house, searching for evidence linking him to the previous murders, and found everything he needed. Jack returned home, realizing Frank was onto him. Frank seized the opportunity to escape, but Jack pursued, shooting at him. They both ended up near the harbor. Suddenly, Frank vanished, then emerged from under a dog and dragged Jack into the water. Using a crowbar, he struck Jack, incapacitating him. Frank surfaced soon after. Shortly after, Satch and his team arrived. They had collected evidence from Jack's home proving he was the serial killer. They took Frank's statement, sent divers to recover Jack's body, and cleared Frank of all charges. Frank returned home, finally at peace. He repaired his radio, discarded a pack of cigarettes he found on the table, and resolved that he would not die from cancer. He vowed never to leave Julia and John alone. He switched on the radio and reconnected with John. Frank said, "Everything's fine, son. Jack Shepard is dead." Yet John noticed that in the present, nothing had changed. Julia was still missing from the family photograph. Suddenly, John was struck by someone. It was the present-day Jack. He attacked Frank as well, rendering him unconscious, then went straight to Julia's room to kill her. The younger John intervened, distracting Jack. Julia attacked him with her nails, leaving marks that immediately appeared on the older Jack's face. Jack knocked Julia unconscious and grabbed the younger John. As he reached the ground floor, he saw Frank standing in front of him, holding a gun. Jack forced the younger John forward, threatening to break his neck if Frank did not lower the weapon. Frank had no choice but to comply. Now, Frank, Julia, and the younger John were in mortal danger, with present-day Jack pointing a gun at John from the future. Jack intended to kill him instantly. At that critical moment, Julia attacked Jack from behind. Frank seized the opportunity to grab the gun and fire. Jack's hand was blown off, and in the same instant, present-day Jack's hand disappeared. It had been lost 30 years ago. Afterward, Frank, Julia, and John were safe. The house, walls, and photographs began transforming, reflecting the corrected timeline. But danger was not yet over. Present-day Jack still had a gun and aimed at John, but someone fired first. Jack was eliminated for good. The shooter was none other than Frank. Finally, John's father, Frank, was alive in this timeline, along with Julia. Samantha returned to John's life, first as a stranger, then as his wife, and they had a beautiful son together. If you loved this thrilling story, don't forget to smash that like button and help us reach 1,000 likes. Topping. Make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss our next epic adventure. Comment below your favorite moment. It might get featured in the next video.